Anyway, as the months passed, I realized that Flinders was going nowhere for me. The owner of this language school, the main aim for her was to make money, and although I acknowledged that she was an excellent teacher herself, unfortunately, she had a ruthless business streak in her, and she regularly dumped her teachers as a result of complaints from her students. Now, this is always a dangerous practice, and in fact, the the students who complained the most were those from Saudi Arabia. And they happened to be often quite spoiled, really. But they were the main source of income for her in this language school, so she had to keep them happy. But in the end, her own class actually tried to cheat in their test results. And she took this personally, and she eventually told the Saudi embassy that she would no longer accept students from them. Only then did she realize what many of her own teachers had been complaining about for many years. There were many teachers who had been telling her about this cheating, but she hadn't listened. So, a few months after her own confrontation with the Saudi embassy, she retired, and I think she sold the business. As I realized that Flinders was not a place I wanted to stay in, there were no long term prospects, I started to look elsewhere. Locally, the options were dismal. Most positions were occupied by locals. With mixed feelings, I turned my attention overseas again. Although I was aware of family dramas, I could see that I wasn't really having much of an influence on them. I drove to the house most days, but I was still having very limited, if any, impact at all. I knew I was still marketable overseas. I was worried, though, about becoming de-skilled. I opened my mind to the possibility of working overseas again. If nothing else, I could send money back to the family. Out of the blue, an email arrived from my former boss in Borneo. The truth is, I didn't much like the guy, but his son was friendly with my eldest son, and he was quite influential on the international educational circuit at that time. He'd been my boss in Borneo. And when I say boss, I mean director. He wasn't in charge of the daily operations, so I didn't know him that well. In the email, he said that he was starting a new company selling educational services, and that this company had bid successfully for a huge project from the Malaysian government involving teacher training. I later discovered that the bidding process was not entirely open or objective or impartial because he was married to someone uh, connected to the Malaysian royal family, and it was through her that he had actually got this contract. Was I interested in helping set up the project? Is the Pope a Catholic? I thought. Of course I was interested. It was a no brainer. I was sold on the idea before I'd finished the email. Malaysia is a lovely country to live in, democracy, and its education was financed by the Malaysian Ministry of Education. However, there were one or two snags. First of all, English language was quite a political issue in Malaysia at that time. Although the national language was Malay, the government taught many subjects, in primary school after year 4 in English. Most exams were in English. This policy was tolerated and even supported in urban areas, but the rural population did not like it because the parents understandably did not use much English in the home at all, and therefore their children were disadvantaged in these school exams. The Ministry of Education were consequently under pressure from the people in rural areas to change this policy so that children would be taught mainly in Malay, not English. Eventually, democracy prevailed and determined that the policy was changed. In primary, the language of instruction and assessment became Malay. Fair enough. But no, the urban elite in Kuala Lumpur were not happy at all with this change. They believed English was the lingua franca of business, science, and technology, and the future. So they resisted this change back to Malay. They thought it was retrograde. As a compromise, the Teaching Fellows Project in Malaysian universities emerged. Crucially, the money did not come from the Ministry of Education, who opposed the project for the political reasons outlined above, but money came from the Deputy Prime Minister's office and who had opposed the change in policy. He used his influence to fund this project. The MOE had to go along with it, but did not approve of it. Anyway, I was so excited, but my boss was vague about details and timelines. Months passed, and I couldn't get a timeline from him for details such as start date, job description, or salary, etc. Eventually, November 2010 arrived, and he said he wanted me to go to Malaysia. I should have realized at the time that he wanted me to lead the project, but I didn't. I had no idea. In fact, what he wanted to do was take a look at me performing in the flesh before he offered me anything. I'm pretty slow on the uptake for these sort of things. The general idea was for the company to recruit and train 15 teaching fellows or training fellows who would update the ESL teaching methodology and pedagogy of Malaysia's top 5 universities. Now, this was an ambitious project by anyone's standards. I was quite shocked, in fact, flabbergasted even, because this wasn't even teacher training, of which I had little or no experience, but this was training of teacher trainers. And in the top universities of Malaysia, it was a very high status project. It was way above my pay grade, as they say. I didn't think about that. I was desperate to get out of Flinders. In spite of my misgivings, I just packed my bags. There were soon red flags. A few days before I departed, my boss told me that the project was having quote, budgetary problems, and that therefore I would have to pay for my own flight to KL and for the computer that I would use in the project. Serious red flags, really. No worries, I was desperate as usual. That was all I knew as I flew into Kuala Lumpur. He met me at the airport and oriented me on the 2-hour journey to Serembang, where he lived and where the project was based. By way of explanation, he said that some people in the universities themselves actually opposed this project, and that was why the budget had been cut. Politics. The first shock was that it turned out that I was the first of the 15 overseas-based training fellows to arrive. There was one actually who he had hired locally. The second surprise was that the project was to start in December, and that was in 3 weeks' time. The third shock was that he wanted me to lead the project. But, he explained, I would be on probation for a while. He didn't explain what that meant. Basically meant I did the job without being paid for it. The other important development was that he suggested Maria join me, my wife. In fact, he set up an interview with the head of a new international primary school in Serembang, and we were both very excited. For the first time in our lives, money just might not be a problem. This headmaster was in Hong Kong at the time and was actually flying to Serembang to do some business and was going to interview Maria there. So the first disappointment was that the interview never happened. Maria flew to Serembang with me for the interview, but this head never arrived in Serembang from Hong Kong. The school then delayed its opening. She was going to open this new school, and Maria had to return to Adelaide within 10 days. We had paid for the flights, of course. We were both very disappointed. I got my head down. My first task was to hire the other 13 training fellows. My boss had managed to delay the opening of the project by a month until January 2011. That gave me 6 weeks now to hire 13 training fellows. Well, it was absurd because they were academics. They needed to give notice to resign from their current posts. More importantly, I wasn't even an academic myself. I was just basically a teacher. He wanted me to use Skype to interview these academics to save money, but I just thought it wasn't going to work. The quality of the calls was so bad at that time. So, unbeknownst to my boss, I interviewed most of these academics on normal phones. So I had a normal conversation. But I'm sure my boss wasn't very happy when he got the bill. Never said anything, though. Anyway, I set about interviewing these people. I got dozens of CVs from the project manager. I had to select those to interview. The project manager was a Malaysian and a very hard-working, loyal to my boss. But he did have a chip on his shoulder because he thought he should be a training fellow himself, which was much better paid than he was. But he was excluded because he was Malaysian, a local. And the training fellows had to be outsiders. He was understandably not happy. He wanted the money like everybody else. It was a hectic few weeks, and they flew by. Remarkably, I managed to get all 15 teaching fellows on deck within the space of 6 weeks by the beginning of January. Quantity, yes, but quality. All of the teaching fellows, by definition, came at very short notice. The selection and recruitment, I would have to say, was anything but a rigorous process. But I didn't have time to reflect on this. And after congratulating me on a job well done, my boss calmly announced that my next task was to write the program which the fellows were to deliver. Again, I was flabbergasted. There was no program. I had not even had time to ask him about the program, but I had assumed there was one. What on earth How could he have got the contract without showing them the program? I just don't know. Anyway, apparently there was no program, and so my next task was to write the program, and I was to be in charge of that. Well, I had no idea where to start. There was worse to come. Before writing the program, he asked me to prepare an orientation week for the newly arriving fellows. My plan, then, was to get the fellows to write the program. I had no other choice, really, as I had no idea how to do it myself. My boss wasn't really interested in the program itself. He was more into the logistics. He wanted bums on seats. He was a businessman. He wanted there to be a show, and he didn't really care, though, what was in the show. The fellows started to arrive in dribs and drabs from all parts of the globe over the Christmas period. I did my best to persuade them that there was a show, if not a program, but it wasn't long before some of them revealed that they were not really very impressed. Things didn't really come to a head until they saw their accommodation after the orientation course, and they went to their posts all over Malaysia. Uh, there were 3 fellows in 5 universities in Malaysia, 2 universities in Kuala Lumpur, and 3 outside Kuala Lumpur. And when they arrived in post, that was when the shit really hit the fan. I remember one meeting, though, well before the Christmas, actually. There was a thing called a planning committee, which I was usually not invited to because I was too busy recruiting. But in this meeting, I was at it. My boss was discussing where he would accommodate these fellows when they first arrived for the 2 weeks. Trying to economize, he suggested the university student hostels, as the students would be on holiday. Now, student hostels in Malaysia are old and fairly primitive structures, and certainly not particularly clean or hygienic. The idea of these senior academics arriving to be put up in these dilapidated structures appalled me. I know from experience that the first impressions of new arrivals in a new project, in a new country, are very important. So alarm bells rang, and I put my foot in my mouth, not for the first time, by suggesting that the fellows would be better placed in more salubrious accommodation. No, they'll be okay. Bloody backpackers, was the response from my boss. I caught my breath and began to sweat a little. I could see that as the head of the project on the ground, I would be the point man and would be expected to manage any complaints. As it turned out, that is exactly what happened. Somehow, we managed to fudge our way through the orientation week, capitalizing on the natural goodwill and enthusiasm of the fellows at the beginning of the project. They agreed with the idea of writing the program themselves, so that was a win for me. Now, the 15 training fellows, as I said, were placed in 5 universities. So after our orientation in Serembang, the fellows all headed off to 5 different locations around the country in early January. I went to Kuala Lumpur as it was thought I needed to be close to my boss in Serembang as the leader of the Fellows Project, and the local head of the English Language Training Center. I needed to be close to her. She was in Kuala Lumpur, and she was actually opposed to this project and had lobbied for the budgetary cuts. So my boss disliked this woman, and she had been instrumental in reducing his budget. She was a constant thorn in his side and wanted to know what we were planning to do. Well, I didn't know, and I don't think my boss knew either. So I started at this point to scheme and look for a way to shed myself of the responsibility of leading what I increasingly came to see as a poisoned chalice. I only had a few meetings with this lady and nothing substantial was discussed because neither of us knew what we were supposed to be doing regarding the project. There was as yet no program. In fact, it turned out to be the same all over the country. Nobody seemed to know what we were supposed to be doing. And in fact, when the fellows arrived in their universities, they were met by local trainers, very senior local academics, who had no knowledge at all of who the training fellows were or what the program was. They hadn't even been informed of it. So, let alone had time to prepare for their arrival and integrate them into their curriculum planning. Yeah. So the first real drama, as I had predicted, was actually over the accommodation. In KL, I had to accompany the 6 fellows to the 2 universities, and they simply couldn't believe it. The basic amenities were appalling. The rooms in the hostel were not clean. There were no towels, no soap, no toilet paper. Things came to a head very quickly, and of course they all rounded on me. So I tried to make light of the situation, but I was actually ashamed. I knew that there were going to be problems, more problems. So I called my boss, and he was unsympathetic. Some of the more assertive fellows had already gone over my head to him. Instead of sympathizing with them and arranging to have their rooms cleaned, properly equipped, he basically told them to stop complaining. I couldn't understand his attitude. Within 24 hours, dire reports then filtered in from the other 4 locations around Malaysia. Horrific stories emerged of fellows arriving in some locations and being accommodated in cheap hotels, which were basically brothels. When fellows were moved to another hotel in one case, they found that this hotel was also a brothel. Soon, fellows were leaving the hostels and brothels around the country and accommodating themselves in quality hotels and then billing the company. My boss was angry. In KL, the 6 of us were in hostels, and after 48 hours, I was the only one left. My boss was furious, but he complimented me for staying, like I was some sort of hero who had not deserted the fort. Combined with the lack of a program, the upshot of all this was a complete loss of confidence in the company and, of course, myself as the leader. The fellows had given me the benefit of the doubt when they had realized there was no program and they'd been asked to write it themselves. But the accommodation fiasco was the last straw for them in terms of respect for the company and myself. They soon began to ignore me and go over my head directly to my boss for all manner of things. They realized that I had no power. The real power lay with my boss. He soon became angry, and some of his anger was directed at me. In his eyes, that is what I was there for. I was there to defend the company from attack, to keep his nose clean. But I was defenseless. He'd given me no weapons with which to defend the company, or himself, or myself. I had no information about anything. Neither did he. But it didn't seem to worry him. Worse still, in the first few weeks, it became increasingly clear that the two universities in KL knew little or nothing about the project. And yeah, as I said before, the same was true in the other universities around the country. No preparation had been done. Similar reports filtered back to me from all over the country. And the result was that the fellows, teaching fellows, had nothing to do. We were expected to go to work, clock in at 7:30 in the morning, and sit at our computers all day doing nothing. This may have suited a few of the less professional fellows at first, but the more professional fellows grumbled and complained immediately, and eventually everybody grumbled. When I explained this to my boss and the project manager in Serembang, they were unsympathetic, because in their eyes it didn't matter what we did as long as we were in post. The MOE paid the company, and the company was then able to pay the fellows. That was the way it worked. Basically, I could see that it would be up to me to write some sort of program at a very low cost. But how? Everyone was scattered all over the country. I began to realize that the task was not possible for me to do. I had lost all credibility, and the boss needed a much more plausible front man or outsider in order to write the program. I didn't even have teacher training experience. How was I to write a program for training the trainers? I knew there would have to be a conference of the fellows in order to discuss how to write the program. What were we going to do in the meantime? I realized that I was not the man for that job, and I started to plan my exit from the leadership role as head training fellow. I had never been confirmed by the boss, of course, anyway, as leader, and never been paid for it. So I started looking for ways to get out of KL and keep away from the dreadful politics between my boss and this powerful local woman in the English Language Training Center in Kuala Lumpur University. My opportunity came when one of the fellows in Kuching on Borneo Island, university there, simply packed up and went home after only 2 weeks. I concocted a story to tell my boss about needing to leave Kuala Lumpur for health reasons. Asthma. My transfer to Kuching solved a problem for my boss, because the company was not paid unless the training fellow was actually on deck. So he needed to get another body anyway for Kuching. I persuaded him that I was feeling out of my depth and that he needed someone more experienced to coordinate the writing of the program. He bought it, and I was soon winging my way to Kuching, happy to leave it behind me. Or so I thought.